Hey guys, still coming off of that cold, pardon my voice. So in today's chapter, things are going to come to a head. We may or may not get a resolution in this chapter. I'm not going to give anything away, so you're just going to have to wait, listen, and be patient. Fun little fact I relearned while reading this chapter is back then, Antelope Island was called Church Island because the church owned the island. So for those of you who don't know, Antelope Island is directly west of where I live. Literally, it feels like it's just down the road. We go there all the time and we love that place. So it was fun hearing my ancestors talk about this island that I always see out my window. And that's what I enjoy about this book is it talks about the early years of where I live. I grew up in the Salt Lake Valley. I was born and raised in Sandy. I now live in Davis County, and this story takes place in both Salt Lake County and later on in Davis County. So I really resonate with this book, and for that reason alone, I love it. Okay, let's go ahead and get started on today's chapter. Chapter 5. The widow, Mrs. Moore, was considered the best nurse and midwife in the city. She had crossed the plains in '49 in the same company that brought Uncle William and Aunt Louisa. The two women had become very close to each other during the journey, and later, after Susan, the widow's only child, had sickened and died of lung fever during their first winter in the valley. Now, utterly alone, she devoted her time to nursing the sick. She was small, wiry, and capable. Though just a little past 40, her dark hair was fast turning gray. Her kind brown eyes were filled with patient understanding. To know this woman was to love her. Having known great sorrow and privation herself, she had developed the knack of putting others at their ease. Originally from Georgia, she had never lost that soft, musical drawl of the Southerner. Mrs. Moore lived in the 13th Ward. Her two-roomed cottage was midway between those of the two Mills brothers. Uncle William lived east 2 blocks, and John's house was west and south a block. The three women were often together making quilts, rugs, soap, or whatever else needed accomplishing at the moment. They had become almost like sisters. Sarah, too, was included in the ring, as the men sometimes laughingly referred to them. Though Martha had tried to persuade her earlier in the day to accompany them, Mrs. Moore had not attended the dance. Instead, she remained at home to finish the quilt they had tied that morning. It was not quite 10:30 p.m. when Uncle William's surrey drew up before the widow's house. Martha quickly alighted and tapped on the door, then disappeared inside. Presently, the two women emerged. Martha was saying, "Dr. Richards came with us. He will make a more thorough examination when we get her in bed. I'm glad we got here before you retired." Then, turning to the man in the back seat, she said, "Charles, this is Mrs. Moore. Come now. The quicker we get your sister to bed, the better she will be." They carried the girl to the house and into the bedroom, where the women soon had her undressed and tucked into the clean, empty cot near the window. Both Martha and Mrs. Moore assisted the doctor and listened attentively to his instructions. Charles and Phil waited in the kitchen. Mrs. Moore insisted that Martha lay Carrie on the larger bed in the opposite corner. The child had slept through the whole proceedings. Uncle William took his team home, with instructions to return for Aunt Louisa later. The doctor's examination was brief, but thorough. His report more encouraging than any had dared hope. Mary Alice was suffering from complete exhaustion, he said. Nothing worse. It was unfortunate that she had overtaxed herself in attending the dance. Her heart was not strong, though her pulse was even and regular. He gave her a mild sedative, and she was asleep before he left. When Aunt Louisa arrived with Sarah and Will, fear had given way to relief concerning the girl. Mrs. Moore even went so far as to suggest that they return to the dance and leave Mary Alice with her. But no one had the slightest desire to do so. Instead, they gathered around the table and ate the lunches. No one spoke above a whisper for fear of disturbing the patient in the next room. Before leaving, Will drew Mrs. Moore aside and pressed a $5 gold piece in her hand. "We can never thank you enough," he whispered, "for your wonderful kindness and hospitality." "There's nothing to worry about," she answered. "I'll take good care of the child somehow," she added, and a mist gathered in her eyes. "She reminds me of my own little Susan, lying there asleep in the cot my own little girl slept in." As the door closed behind Will and Phil, Sarah felt the room close in about her with an almost stifling pressure. She longed to obey her impulse to rush after him, beg him never to leave her again so long as she lived. Instead, she laid down her half-eaten sandwich and began mechanically to clear the table, replacing unused food in the baskets. Martha stole noiselessly into the bedroom and returned with Carrie. "I'll take her," offered Charles, and they too departed, leaving the widow in charge of the patient with promises to return early the following day. Very little was said during the walk home. When they reached the gate, Martha took her child from Charles and went inside, leaving Sarah and Charles alone. Sarah had dreaded this moment. If only she could escape into the house before he had time to say the things she knew he intended saying. Or if she could tell him once and for all that she was through, never wanted to see him again. It had all been a mistake from the very beginning. She had never really loved him. Will was the man she worshipped, but Will had cautioned her to wait. So she left the words that formed in her mind unsaid. Not so much to spare Charles, for somehow his feelings did not disturb her. She closed her mind to what his reaction might be, but Will had asked her to forbear. That, to Sarah, was the important thing. His wishes were all that really mattered. She sidled toward the center of the path, hoping to slip past Charles in the darkness, before he could anticipate her intention. Then she would bid him good night and dart into the house. Her skirt brushed his knee. The night was so dark. He was closer than she thought. She could not get by without touching him. She hesitated. His arm reached out, found her, and gently encircled her waist. She stood perfectly still, fighting back her desire to free herself. "What became of you and Will after the last dance?" he asked, trying to hide the agitation in his voice. "We came around the block, through the west gate, rather than buck the crowd," she answered calmly. "You certainly took your time. We waited, and then finally had to go without you." "We weren't trying to hurry. How were we to know about Mary Alice?" "I see." She sensed his tension and longed to escape. Suddenly, she felt desperately tired. If only she could sink down somewhere and relax. But Charles was speaking again. She forced herself to listen. "That stranger you danced with, I've never seen him before." "Who?" "He knew my father," she broke in. "Please, Charles, do you mind? I'm so tired tonight. Can't we talk some other time?" "You're putting me off, Sarah, but it's no use. I will know what happened. Tell me. Darling, don't pull away from me. I love you. You're mine. Nothing—" "Charles, stop it!" She wrenched herself free. "Understand this. You don't own me. You never have, and you never shall. So there. Now I've made you angry again. I keep forgetting what a little fire trap you are. If you'll forgive me, I'll go, and we'll talk another time." He gathered her to him and kissed her unresponsive lips. "Good night," she whispered, and fled into the house. Sarah did not go to sleep for a long time after she crept into bed. She lay thinking of the many events that had happened since she hung the new curtains in their living room that morning. It seemed so long ago. Then she had been a little girl, a child, unsure of herself and what life really meant. Now she was a woman, sure of what she wanted and determined to secure her newfound happiness, come what may. Each time she thought of Will, of that first moment in his arms, his cool, tender lips over hers, she was drenched anew in unspeakable ecstasy. She closed her eyes and let the joy her thoughts brought flow through her like wine. "Oh, thank you, God. Thank you for sending him to me in time, she repeated over and over in her mind. All I ask is that you let me be his wife. God, just let me be his wife. She slept at last with the image of her beloved glowing in her heart and a smile on her lips. Presently she was carried away in a dream. She stood by a deep black pool of water. She made her way there through the muddy swamp that surrounded it, parting the tall, thick grass and cattails with her hands as she came. She entered the swamp in great haste, yet with extreme precaution, for she was being pursued. She had come there to hide, but now she could go no farther because of the water, which looked deep and dangerous. As she stood perfectly still, she was filled with apprehension, so that she took no notice as the soft mud oozed into her shoes, though she felt the icy dampness penetrate to the very marrow of her bones. Still, she made no effort to move, for at that moment she heard the voice of her pursuer. It was Charles. It seemed to reach her from every direction at the same time. "Sarah! Sarah! Where are you?" She crouched down, sinking deeper into the sticky mud, drawing the reeds and tall grass around her for protection. Her feet were numb and her knees ached, but she neither moved nor answered the repeated calls, which, to her relief, seemed only to surround and not enter the swamp. Then her eyes became rooted to the center of the pool, where a thick white mist began to form just above the black water. As she watched, a great white stallion with arched neck and heavy mane and tail, soft as new corn silk, appeared in the misty cloud. She could not see the face of the rider, also clothed in white, but she knew it was Will. The stallion pawed and pranced in the cloud, his feet only a few inches from the water, but not actually touching it. She noted that man and beast were accurately reflected in its smooth surface. The voice, still calling, had become gradually fainter, taking on a mournfully wailing tone. "Come back to me, Sarah! Please come back to me!" She paid no attention to the cries, but she felt much less afraid now that she knew Will was near. Suddenly the cloud began to rise slowly and drift toward the opposite side of the swamp. Sarah, too, stood upright, and with outstretched arms she cried in alarm, "Will, here I am! Don't go without me, Will! Please don't go without me." She would have flung herself into the frightening water in pursuit of him, but the gluey mud closed in tightly about her feet and ankles, holding her in suction-like vice, from which she could not budge. Again and again she cried out to him as she struggled to free herself, but he seemed neither to see her nor hear her. The cloud moved slowly but relentlessly on, outward and upward. As it finally vanished completely, the grief-stricken girl's arms dropped to her sides, and she sank, prostrate and sobbing, onto the cold, slimy mud. She was awakened from the nightmare by her mother gently stroking her forehead. "Sarah, Sarah, what's the matter? Stop crying, dear." She sat up in her bed, trembling and shaken. Her cheeks and lashes were drenched with tears. "Oh, Mother," she said at last, "I had the strangest dream. Do you believe in dreams?" "I try not to be superstitious, dear." Somehow her mother's words placed a barrier between them. Sarah realized that her dream would hold no significance for her practical-minded mother. She could not tell it to her. Her soul reached out in longing to her wise, understanding father. If only he were here. She spoke her thoughts aloud, almost without realizing it. "I wish Father were here. He'd know what to do. I know he would." "Don't be upset by a silly dream, Sarah. More than likely, you were just overtired. Remember, you've had a long, exciting day, what with Charles coming and all. There's more to it than that, Mother. I may as well tell you now. I'm not going to marry Charles. Ever. You're too young to marry anyone yet, my dear. I believe we grow more by our experiences than by the years we live," answered the girl. "True, I'm not yet 16, but I've crossed the ocean and lived in at least 5 different cities in the United States. to say nothing of crossing the plains, forging rivers, being stolen by Indians, nursing the sick and dying at winter quarters. Sarah, I've never heard you talk like this before. What has come over you? I'm in love with Will, Mother. I'd marry him tomorrow if he asked me. Her words hit Martha like a dash of cold water. She had been sitting on the edge of Sarah's bed in her nightgown. She had not struck a light, as the late moon shining through the window was sufficient for her to find her way. As had happened on several precious occasions, she felt an odd sense of helplessness as Sarah made her astounding declaration. Yet somehow, mingled with this, was that familiar twinge of jealousy toward her husband, that this child, whom they both loved so deeply, should instinctively turn to him, instead of her, when crises in her own life arose. She said at last, "He'd put to stop any idea of a hasty marriage for you." Then, not wishing to be harsh or unsympathetic, she continued, "No true lady ever pursues a man, Sarah. It makes her cheap and common in the eyes of others, and especially to the man in question. You are young and attractive. Many men will want to marry you, and you owe it to yourself to become acquainted with others near your own age, and not fling yourself into the arms of the first one who attracts you. Nothing you can say will change my mind, Mother. Will is the only man on earth for me. I know that, the same as I know the gospel is true, or that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God. You frighten me when you speak like that, Sarah. Why? The man isn't even a member of the church." "He will be someday, perhaps, but suppose, after all, he refuses to join. Has he discussed this matter with you?" "No, not yet. We only met this morning." Martha sighed helplessly. A slight shiver of apprehension swept through her. What was she to do? She realized that she was no longer dealing with a sweet, submissive child, but with a woman whose mind was made up. Only John could handle this new Sarah, and John was hundreds of miles away. It would take weeks even for a letter to reach him. A breeze blew through the open window. She shivered again. "Go back to bed, Mother, and don't worry. Everything will come out all right. I'm not afraid anymore. You'll catch cold sitting there in your nightgown, and you need your rest. I wonder what time it is. Nearly morning, I suppose. And you sure you're all right?" "Yes, I'm fine now. I wanted to tell you about Will when I came in, but you were in bed. Tomorrow I'll write a nice long letter to Father and explain everything to him. So stop worrying and try to rest." Martha bent and kissed her on the forehead. "Good night, dear, and go to sleep yourself, or you won't feel much like work tomorrow." More than a week had passed before Sarah saw either Charles or Will again. They had joined a party of men who went into the hills for timber. The trip took from 5 to 7 days, if weather was good, and all went well. Great quantities of logs would be needed for winter fuel, as well as for building purposes. Those who owned teams and were able to go made good money hauling timber from the mountains. Mr. Coles, the man from whom they rented their cottage, came early the morning following the dance and explained the trip to the Oakes brothers. They accepted his invitation, glad of the opportunity to earn a good wage. Phil was left to take care of the cottage and attend Mary Alice if she was able to return home during their absence. Mary Alice was still asleep the next morning when Phil came to inquire after her. He informed Mrs. Moore of his brother's departure and explained that he was an excellent nurse himself and would take his sister home as soon as she woke. "You'll do nothing of the kind, my boy," exclaimed the widow. "I'll not hear of it. She stays right here with me, at least until your brothers return. Not that I doubt your nursing ability," she added hastily, noting his crestfallen expression. "But the girl's in no condition to be moved, at least for several days. Now," she continued, "don't look so unhappy. You may come to see her as often as you wish. You may even be able to do a great deal to help out, if you cared to." "If I really could," he pleaded anxiously. "There's a wood pile out back of the house," she suggested, smiling, "and my wood box is empty." His long, lean figure disappeared, like Ichabod's shadow, around the corner of the cabin. Soon the rhythmical crack of his axe greeted Mary Alice as she opened her eyes, looking around in bewilderment at her unfamiliar surroundings. Then suddenly memory returned. As Mrs. Moore appeared in the doorway carrying a glass of milk and a piece of buttered toast on a plate. "Awake, dear? I thought you might be. There now, don't try to get up. You must rest quietly and take things easy for a few days. Then you'll be strong enough to be about." "But really, I'm not sick," protested the girl. "I know, but your heart is very tired, and you must give it a chance to rest. See, I have some breakfast for you." The widow took charge in her kind matter-of-fact way, and soon her patient converted, comfortable and contented. As the days went by, they became more and more attached to each other. The girl was so genuinely grateful for each little service rendered. It was a pleasure to care for her. Gradually, Mrs. Moore learned the whole tragic story of their long, tedious journey from England, of the final death of the frail little mother, and of the girl's severe illness. "When Mother died, and we had to bury her out there on the lonely sagebrush desert, I didn't want to get well," she said, "but Will and the others worked so hard to save me. Everyone in the company was so kind, bringing me precious little dainties to tempt my appetite, things I couldn't really spare, that I tried to live." There were tears on her cheek as she spoke of her mother, while the loneliness and tragedy in her voice tore at the sympathetic heart of her listener. Finally, on the 6th day, Mrs. Moore voiced the thought that had been forming in her mind. "Mary Alice," she said, "I told you about losing my own little girl, and of how bitterly I miss her. I've been a widow for 11 years, and there is no one left who really belongs to me. My dear, I've loved having you here. Since you came, that dreadful emptiness has gone. You fill a need in my life, even as I would like to fill one in yours. When your brothers come back, I'm going to ask them to let you live with me permanently. That is, if you'd like to. Would you, dear?" "Oh, yes, Mrs. Moore. Next to my mother, you're the sweetest person I've ever known. Always I shall try to be a good daughter to you, and I promise you'll never regret your wonderful kindness. Perhaps someday I may be able to take care of you. If you need a nurse, I want to learn nursing. Will you teach me?" "We'll decide that later, dear, when you're really well." That evening, as the two sat in the kitchen reading, Mary Alice looked across at Mrs. Moore and asked, "Mrs. Moore, do you think we knew each other in heaven before we came here on earth to live?" "Perhaps we did, dear. We are told that we all grew to maturity as spirit children of the Father before we came here and took mortal bodies, in order to progress still more. I feel like I've always known you. We must be kindred spirits, don't you think?" "Bless your heart, child, we must be. At any rate, we're good for each other." The first few days of logging in the rugged Wasatch Mountains was hard and strenuous work for all the men. Night found them so exhausted that food and rest were their chief concern. Then gradually they became accustomed to the work and enjoyed sitting around the campfire, singing old songs, swapping yarns, or just relaxing after the day's work. Will sat gazing into the fire, enjoying his evening pipe. He had pulled on his leather jacket, for the nights up here were chill. The picturesque beauty of the mountains fascinated him. There were none to compare them in England. He contemplated their awe-inspiring heights by moonlight, their brows kissing the starlit sky, their mighty foundations reaching down to unfathomable depths in the valleys and meadows. How mighty is God's handiwork, he thought. How did these long-suffering saints ever find this far-distant, hidden spot in the vast desert wastelands? He had heard the story of Brigham Young's dream, and now his famous words, when too ill to walk, he had been helped to the canyon's brink, and looking down into the great Salt Lake Valley for the first time, said, "This is the place." Was there something to what these Mormons believed? Did they really have some basis for their fanatical belief in Joseph Smith and Brigham Young? Or had they, as the world at large believed, been clearly tricked into this new and different religion by a few scheming scoundrels? How he wished he knew. Once he had thought of applying for baptism, more to please his mother than for any personal benefit. Then her tragic death had robbed him of any desire whatsoever to affiliate himself with the religion that was, in his opinion, responsible for her death. Later, he had met Sarah. Her entrance into his life had changed his world. Now he wanted to know the truth, for the truth's sake. His utter sincerity lent him caution. Never would he plunge blindly into Mormonism merely to win the girl he loved. That would be cheating them both. No, if in the future he were to become a member, it would be because he knew within himself that the leaders were all they pretended to be, men sent by God to reestablish His church on the earth. To do this would require time and study. He determined to read the church works, all of them, and discuss their doctrine with officials who could answer his questions. Yes, it was worth a try, and he would probe it to his own satisfaction, one way or the other. He was roused from his meditation by Charles, who spoke as he approached his brother. "I'd like you to come look at Cole's bay mare," he said. "She cut herself this afternoon on a piece of wire." "Did you bring that black oil along?" asked Will, rising and following Charles through the trees towards the horses. "Yes, I've cleaned the wound and applied the oil. I think she'll be all right. The wound isn't deep. Fact is, I used that more as an excuse to get you away from the crowd. Do you realize we haven't had more than 5 minutes alone together during this whole trip? We'll be going back in a day or two, and I'm anxious to talk with you first." "Here it comes," thought Will. "Perhaps it is just as well. Sooner or later we must have it out together. If only there were some way to spare him. But how? How?" Aloud he said, "Where's the mare?" "Never mind her. I only use that as an excuse. Let's sit over here on this log there," he said, adjusting himself to the rounding surface of the huge tree trunk. "Tired?" he asked as Will eased down beside him. "Rather, but not as bad as the first night or two. The nights are wonderfully cool up here. Makes sleeping a pleasure." "Yes, the winters are terrific, they tell me. Snow gets 10 to 20 feet deep in some of these canyons. In the summer, it gradually melts and runs into the valley. These people use it to irrigate their crops. They actually raise corn, wheat, and all kinds of vegetables. They seem to be industrious. Not afraid of hard work either. Quite likable, most of them." "Most ways, yes." Then, after a pause, Charles continued, "It's Sarah I want to talk about. Now you've seen her, what's your honest opinion?" He slapped at a mosquito that persistently buzzed near his ear. There was no answer. A tense silence hung between them. Several times Will opened his lips to speak, but no sound came. Charles turned to him in the darkness. All he could see was a white splotch that he knew was Will's face. "Why don't you say something?" he demanded. "Charles, there is so much to say. I don't know how to begin." "You still think she's too young? You don't mean—" "I mean, you've got competition, Charles." "Haven't I been trying to tell you that? You mean that stranger at the dance?" "No, I mean myself." Though he spoke the words scarcely above a whisper, they were unmistakably clear. They pierced the other's heart like steel. As though he had been jerked to his feet by an invisible cord, Charles leaped up and stood with clenched fists before his brother. "What did you say?" Will had also risen, and the two stood facing each other only inches apart. "I love her too." Again his words were a simple statement of fact. "I don't ask you to understand, Charles. Not now. But I had to tell you. There was no other way." "She's mine! I found and won her. I was suspicious of every man in the city, dang polygamists that they are, but you I trusted." His words came in hoarse, choked gasps. Every muscle in his body grew tense as a tiger before it springs. "If you were not my brother," he hissed, "you must know I'm not afraid of you, Charles. There is no time for threats. I realize that our whole future is at stake, yours and mine. Still, that is not the most important thing. If we were the only ones involved, I would gladly step aside. But there's Sarah. Her happiness comes before either yours or mine. Are you willing to let her choose between us?" "Dang you, no! I'll brook no interference from you or anyone else where she is concerned." "It was never my intention to interfere. This thing hit me. Then clear out. Go back east. Leave the dang country." I thought of doing just that, but what? It would solve nothing, not only because I love Sarah, but because she loves me. That's a lie. You'll never make me believe that. You're too wrought up to see reason in anything, Charles. Believe me, I know how you feel. All my life, I've cared more what happened to you than what might become of me. My one aim in life has been to help you over the rough spots. When that temper of yours got on the rampage, Mother explained to me when we were just kids that no matter how much we may resemble each other physically, your nature and mine were entirely different. I am slow to anger, but your fury burns like a flame, and though it's quickly quenched, may someday do untold harm. Not only to yourself, but to others, perhaps innocent victims. You were her favorite, Charles. She loved you best. It was of you she spoke, almost with the last breath she drew. Find him, she said, and tell him I was not afraid to die, for I know this wonderful new gospel is true, and if he will investigate it thoroughly, he too will find eternal peace for his wild, excitable, lovable nature. There was no answer, but a low half-sob, half-groan, escaped Charles as he stumbled away toward the camp, leaving Will standing alone in the darkness. The smoke from the campfires scented the crisp mountain air with its fragrance of burning pine. Strains of mouth organ from over near the camp mingled with the chorus of chirping crickets. A high spasmodic breeze rippled through the pines, but all the night's mystery and beauty were lost upon Charles as he groped in the wagon for his bedding. There was little sleep for either of them that night. Each lay in his blanket, thinking. Since earliest childhood, they had been closest pals. This was the first time an unsurmountable difference had arisen between them. Each suffered in his own way. Charles looked up into the midnight sky, past the swaying pine tops that looked like black lace fringe on purple velvet against the canopy of half-hidden stars and glimmering moonbeams through deep smoke silver gray clouds. But what he saw was Sarah's smooth oval face, the deep arched dip her hair made in the center of her forehead, the proud lift of her chin, the fearless gleam of defiance in her eyes when he tried to persuade her against Will. He thought of her body, the time he had rescued her from the Platte River, where she most certainly would have drowned but for him. He remembered the feel of her precious weight in his arms as he carried her to shore. Her wet dress clinging tightly to her limp form had revealed to him the perfection of her feminine contour. He had been aware of her since first he entered the Mormon camp, feeling an attraction that he vainly tried to dispel. It had increased 100-fold when he held her in his arms. He knew then that he meant to win and possess her. She became an obsession with him. It had been so long since he fought against it that he had forgotten that it had ever been otherwise. For weeks, nay months, he had thought of her as already his. Charles had always got what he wanted, sooner or later, because of his stubborn determination. Now he could not probe the depths of his defeat. In fact, he admitted none. If Will loved her, it was too bad for him. He'd have to get over it. As for Sarah's feelings, she had promised to, or at least admitted that she loved him. He'd hold her to that. Yet, fight, reason, argue with himself as he would, a terrible doubt reared itself within his heart as to how far he could force the proud-spirited girl. Anger, surprise, jealousy, all shook him by turns, until he was in a tumult of conflicting emotions. He was wild to get back to the city to Sarah, hoping against hope that he could persuade her to marry him. He'd promise her anything, if only she'd marry him at once. Like a shaft through a wooden shield came Will's words. "Are you not afraid of me then?" So that's what he meant. And Sarah, putting him off, always putting him off. How dare they treat him like this? It wasn't true. He couldn't stand anything on earth but to lose her. What a blind fool I was, he thought wildly, to urge them together as I did. It all happened at the dance, of course. But I'll never give her up, never. He tossed and turned, fighting back the reality of the thing, his thoughts darting madly, this way and that, like a cornered animal striving in vain for a way out. Will was no less disturbed. Knowing his brother's violent nature, he realized the full extent of his suffering. It would be all the more poignant because it was his first encounter with complete frustration where anything of great importance was involved. Yet, he had reasoned through each hour of the days following his and Sarah's revelation of their love for each other, that hers was the most important of their 3 lives to be considered. Had it been Charles, instead of himself, for whom she had expressed a preference, he would have acted accordingly, regardless of his own feelings. Surely, he told himself, after the first shock of disappointment's over, Charles would feel as he did. No man would want to force a woman into a loveless marriage. However, shot through all his reasoning was the feeling that somehow he was betraying his brother, as well as his mother's trust in him, by loving and accepting this girl's love. Why couldn't it have been he who found her first? Why, in order to make her as well as himself happy, must he destroy his brother's hope of happiness? After all, was it right for him to stay? But remembering Sarah's tragic despair when he mentioned leaving, he knew he could not desert her, even to spare his brother. Gradually, quiet settled over the camp. One by one, the men wrapped themselves in their blankets and settled down for the night. Only the 2 watchmen were left to replenish the fire and guard against wild animals. There were many coyotes in the mountains, as well as bears, wildcats, and mountain lions. Though they were not so troublesome at this time of year, it was necessary to be on guard, especially at night. There was a feeling of fall in the air, especially up here in the mountains, subtle at first, though, as day succeeded day, it became more and more noticeable. The leaves on the maple trees were still bright green, except for a yellow one here or there on the underneath branches. Next morning, a thin, glass-like layer of ice clung to the edge of the canyon stream when the men descended to water their horses. "Looks like we'll have an early fall," commented one. Logging in the early Utah pioneer days was anything but easy. The mountain roads leading up into the heavy timber were mere trails. No wagon or team could be driven the entire distance. The men removed the wagon bodies from the wheels and joined the front seat to the back by means of a heavy plank. They drove as far as they could up the steep winding canyon road, with the wagon skeletons going the remaining distance on foot and horseback. The logs had to be cut and dragged down to the vehicles, loaded and driven into town. Nothing could be floated down the canyon streams. They were too narrow, twisting, and shallow, so all the work had to be done by hand, the hard way. They worked early and late, as long as there was light to see. Existence was a constant and bitter struggle, but no one shirked his allotted share of work. They conquered the vast country inch by inch through toil and unstinted labor. Often they worked in pairs, as was the case with Charles and Will. But since their discussion over Sarah, not an unnecessary word passed between these 2. Several times Will made attempts at conversation, but his efforts were met with hard, stony silence and a curt yes or no. Not until they were on their way home, atop a heavy load of logs, did Charles speak. His words sounded as though his throat were dry, rasping, like sandpaper on granite. "I'd like to see and talk with her first, when we get there," he said. Will, who was driving the team, looked up in surprise. His eyes traveled slowly over his brother. Both were dirty and unshaven. They were in a thick cloud of dust, one of a long train of loaded wagons. The hot sun beat down upon them without relief. Sage and oak brush lined either side of the narrow, bumpy road. They had left the coolness and shade of the canyon and were on the winding, downward trail leading toward the valley. Huge boulders here and there on the east side against the hills seemed to draw and intensify the sun's rays, radiating heat in a thin vapor-like mirage as they drove along. Cottontails, chipmunks, and squirrels peeked at them from the roadside. Some even ventured to scurry quickly across the road between the wagons. They were still high enough on the trail to look westward down beyond the city to the Great Salt Lake. There was no wind, not even a breeze, and its surface was still and smooth as polished steel. Church Island, stretched across its center, looked like a tiny mountain rising out of the sparkling salt water. Will put the reins into one hand, while with the other he reached into his back pocket, bringing forth a much soiled handkerchief. He wiped the sweat from his face and neck. Charles sat directly behind him on the hard, uncomfortable logs as he waited for an answer to his statement. His eyes bored smolderingly into his brother's back. Such a tide of resentment welled up within him that he clenched his fists to keep from reaching out and grasping Will and flinging him from the moving vehicle. "Aren't you going to say anything?" Again, that harsh, unnatural rasping. Will shifted his position to turn sideways. "Of course. I think you have a right to see her first. I'm willing to meet you halfway in anything you suggest. Will you then give me a month alone with her? Clear out somewhere, anywhere, only keep away for a month, and give me a real chance to win her back?" Now he could not hide a certain note of eager pleading from his tone. He watched his brother's profile with hawk-like intensity for any sign of reaction. Will felt his heart contract at the thought of leaving Sarah for so long a time. Not that he doubted her decision, but he knew how savagely Charles would strive to persuade her against her will, and he dreaded the ordeal for her sake. But he allowed none of his thoughts to show in his face, though he remained silent long moments before answering. He fought a short but fierce battle within himself. At last he said, "All right, Charles, I'll do as you ask. I'll go south for a few weeks. They need carpenters and workmen, I'm told, in Provo. A number of houses are being built, and they are anxious to have them ready before winter sets in. I'll leave in the morning. You must tell Sarah for me that." Yes, I'll tell her." There was such relief and elation in his tone and manner that Will felt a lump swell in his throat as he listened. "I must give him every chance," he thought. "Never could I find a moment's happiness or joy afterward if I felt I had robbed him of a single opportunity. Besides, he must learn from Sarah's own lips where he stands with her. That's his right." It was dusk by the time they delivered and unloaded the wood and headed for home. Charles showed his appreciation by being more like his old self after winning the promise from Will. Phil had water heated for shaves and bath, having seen the loads of wood being unloaded at the square, and knowing that his brothers would want to clean up as soon as they arrived home. After supper, tired though he was, Charles began preparations for visiting Sarah that evening. "Wouldn't it be wiser to wait till after I've left town before you go to see her?" suggested Will. "I'll do it my way," he answered curtly, though he saw at once that Will was right. He continued his preparations and finally left the cottage. He did not go at once to Sarah's place. Instead, he walked aimlessly block after block through the city, trying to make up his mind to go to Sarah, yet dreading to bring the issue to a head until he was more sure of himself. He knew he must fight, and fight hard to win her back. He must use every precaution not to arouse her anger. If he waited until Will was out of town, it would most certainly be to his advantage. Yet he ached to see her, to wring from her a promise to become his wife. Then, like a bolt from the blue, a thought struck him, and he muttered to himself, "That's it! Why not? I'll even promise her to join the dang Mormons if she'll marry me at once. That'll bring her round. She can't refuse me then. It won't hurt me to be a member. I'll do as I dang well please anyway. Perhaps I'll even try reforming someday, when I'm old and ready to die. I never thought I'd be so crazy about a woman that I'd join a polygamist outfit to get her. I guess that's what those poor fools would call a miracle," and he laughed scornfully to himself. He turned and walked toward the Mills cottage. Upon reaching it, he found the house in darkness. It was later than he realized. He lingered a moment, then slowly started homeward. "I'll see her tomorrow," he promised himself. "After Will's gone. It'll be better that way anyway." During his absence, Will had gone to Mrs. Moore's and had a talk with her and his sister. He finally agreed to let Mary Alice stay with the widow for the time being, but would not promise that it would be permanent. He told them that he was going to Provo the following morning and would see them immediately upon his return. Both Phil and he had retired when Charles came in. Will left at daybreak next day without disturbing either of his sleeping brothers. And that's it for chapter 5. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts about where the story is going down in the comments below. It only gets more interesting from here. Hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I will see you next week for chapter 6.